2014 Borlaug Cast Communication Award winner. And I really want to emphasize the word communication, because that's one of the key pieces that the search committee looks at. You know, there's a lot of great scientists, and I think we can all attest that sometimes scientists aren't necessarily the best communicators. So it's when you find those rare individuals that have that ability to communicate, particularly with the public. You know, we tend to be good communicating with each other as scientists, but when we can reach the public, then we know we've made a big difference. And so in order to have that ability, someone has to have passion. And I want to tell you a little bit about Alison. I learned last night that when she was 19, she was an exchange student where she went over to Texas, and a pure passion for agriculture. From coming originally from Australia, she came over to the great state of Texas, and her surrogate parents are here with us to celebrate her receiving this award. And she really enjoyed the United States, so she decided to come back over here to get her PhD at UC Davis. And of course, that's where she met her husband. And she enjoyed the California life so much that she decided to stay there. And I can attest to that. I now live in San Diego. So. Well, Alison has published 60 peer-reviewed articles, and that's impressive. But the thing that really, in my mind, validates why she deserves this award is being on the Dr. Oz show. And which is, you know, it's a big deal. I know sometimes we tend to be, you know, critical of Dr. Oz, but it is a big deal. You know, how many millions of people are reached by that? The other thing, she's been on Animal Planet. And, you know, not many scientists get on Animal Planet. And she's also been on NPR several times, and she's a big fan of YouTube. So if you want to see some of the clips that she's made, just go to YouTube and search for it. So I want to hand it over to Dr. Alison Van Eenennaam and let her tell you more about what she does. Thank you.
We present the 2014 Borlaug Cast Communication Award to Alison, and we wish her continued success in all her endeavors. Now you'll
Well, wow. Thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be here and to accept this award. I first would like to thank CAST for the honor of selecting me for this award, and also the American Society of Animal Science, who was a scientific society that nominated me, and also for some of the letter writers of support who I see here in the audience, and of course DuPont for sponsoring the award. It's the namesake Borlaug is obviously a very big one for agricultural scientists, and actually in some small way his legacy is actually the inspiration for me becoming an agricultural scientist. In Australia, where I was born, major college decisions are made during high school, and I remember an agricultural science student coming to talk to me at high school and talking to me about the possibility of having a career in agricultural science. I'm an urban girl, and that hadn't really occurred to me up until that point. You know, switch down. Nope. What are we doing here, guys? There we go. Up until that point, I was growing up in Australia in the 60s and 70s. I recall there were, famines going on, and it was quite a common occurrence in Australia to see starving people on the television, and I remember participating in the World Vision 40-hour famine. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but basically you fast for 40 hours, and I remember you go around and people would sponsor you 10 cents an hour if you're really lucky, because that was a $4 donation, and if you got 20 cents, it was an $8 donation, and it really was part of the dialogue growing up in Australia in the 60s and 70s, and the concept of pursuing a career in agricultural science where I might actually work to make a difference in agricultural productivity was a very appealing career choice, and although perhaps not a common one for kind of a city-raised bookish girl who had a passion for both horses and science. I intentionally enrolled for agricultural science. That was my chosen degree, and I chose to do so because of an interest in agriculture, probably a little bit to the surprise of my parents, who were urban people. My dad was a professor of psychology at a university, and so having said that, Mum was all about getting education for girls and making sure that I pursued whatever my interests were, and so they were quite supportive of doing agricultural science. As was alluded to earlier, I took a gap year during my computer doesn't appear to be responding. Okay, here we go. I took a gap year and I did what's called the International Agricultural Exchange Association, and I went and worked on a cattle ranch in Texas. And you can see here, that's my bull riding experience. You can see I made the 8 seconds. I could have probably made 8 hours, to be honest with you. This was not one of the more aggressive bulls, but he's a Santa Gertrudis bull, and it was there that I worked on a ranch that was involved in the use of advanced reproductive technologies, embryo transfer and semen collection, and that's where I really became interested in the possibility of using genetics in animal agriculture to advance the rate of genetic improvement, and so my passion was born. I then worked at an animal health company in Australia, focusing mostly on pastoral production systems, before moving to the US to undertake my degrees at the University of California in Davis. And it was there I became familiar with the land grant system, obviously established by the Morrill Act of 1962 to educate citizens in agriculture, home economics, mechanical arts and other practical professions. And then of course cooperative extension. Ironically, it's celebrating its 100th year this year, and how appropriate that Norman Borlaug and cooperative extension share a birth year. Extension, of course, is really developing practical applications of research knowledge and giving instruction and practical demonstrations of existing and improved practices of technologies in agriculture. And I think if you look at the American spending on extension through the land grant system, it's probably had an unparalleled return on investment in terms of agricultural productivity over the last 100 years. And the latent demand, I think, for agricultural extension in some of the developing countries is really evident, a point I'll return to later. For me, a career in extension was really a match made in heaven, as it combined my interest in science with applied practical applications. I first worked in San Joaquin County as a county-based extension agent in livestock and dairy, mostly intensive agricultural production systems, rather different to what I was accustomed to in Australia. And then I did my PhD and then came back since 2002 working as a specialist in the area of animal biotechnology and genomics. And I think if you're already working in animal agriculture, which in and of itself has a touchstone issue for some, and then you start working on topics as controversial as genetic engineering and cloning, you better learn to be a good communicator or you're going to spend your entire life hiding at your lab bench. And so I think it was really required that I learn how to communicate. I actually do also have an active research program, mostly funded through the USDA public funding, where we're using genomic selection and tools along those lines to try to improve beef cattle and select for animals that are less susceptible to disease. And I must admit, sometimes I quite like going to the lab and just running a PCR and seeing the right size band. There's something somewhat gratifying about seeing the band you're expecting on a gel, and nobody's cross with you for doing that. However, the bulk of my work is really involved with outreach and extension. And you know, my extension program's objective is to provide research and education on the use of animal genomics and biotechnology in livestock production systems. And over the years, I have worked with a variety of production systems. I've worked with beef cattle, cow-calf operations using rangeland. I've worked with intensive dairies in the San Joaquin Valley. I've worked with organic dairies out on the coast. I've worked with people that are raising their beef naturally. I've worked with grass-fed beef producers and others that are raising them in a conventional fashion. And you know, I see there's so much similarity between the problems that all of these production systems are facing with. They have somehow to minimise the impact of pests and diseases while still optimising animal productivity, health and welfare, and producing product according to their chosen production system, also while maintaining economic viability. And I have the utmost respect for the producers of this country, and I'm absolutely delighted to be participating in the discussion after this with the Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, and it's nice to have some farmers at the table. So with that background then, I'll leave you work on to discussing the livestock revolution. And it's a term that was first kind of coined in about 1999 to discuss, and it insinuates an analogy to the Green Revolution, and it's really describing the fact that the combination of population growth, rising per capita income and progressive urbanisation are really creating an unprecedented growth in the demand of food from animal origin in developing countries, which is giving rise to major opportunities and potentially threats. Livestock production is the world's largest user of land, either directly through grazing or indirectly through the consumption of fodder and feed grains. Globally, livestock production currently accounts for some 40% of the gross value of agricultural production. And so this rising demand is not necessarily driven by a huge increase in the amount of animal protein that's going to be consumed in developing countries, as is indicated on this graph here by the dashed lines, with the purple being milk and the red being meat. But really, it's being driven by the size of the population that's going to be consuming this product. Developing countries are expected to continue to increase their share of world production of meat so that by 2050 they could account for 70% of the world's meat production and 61% of the world's milk production. Of course, this graph is what's projected. It's not necessarily what will happen. And there are many voices out there who argue that this may not, or perhaps more stridently should not, be allowed to occur. And I'd like to discuss the three viewpoints that I see coming at this issue, because I think depending which viewpoint you're coming with, you often speak past each other as a result of different perceptions of what the actual problem is. And I'm sure you've all seen these interconnected circles of sustainability, and I'd like to introduce you to this concept of the three different takes as it relates to what I say the livestock revolution. And each of these different approaches have their own assumptions and trade-offs, and I'll go through each one in turn. The first one is production challenge, and that is there's a problem. We have increased mouths to feed, increased demand for animal protein, and so we need to change how food is produced by improving the efficiency of food production. This is also sometimes called sustainable intensification, and it's really scientists with a very strong sense of optimism and pragmatism thinking that they can use science to help solve this problem. And there's little attention paid to some of the potential negative effects, maybe of overconsumption of beef products or animal products. And rather, the focus tends to be on stressing the importance of animal protein in the developing world, especially for people who may not be consuming very much of anything, let alone animal protein. And it tends to focus on the demand and the consumption patterns of urban populations. As a scientist, I guess I'm innately kind of in this camp because I see technology and science as the solution to try to improve the productive efficiency. And as an animal breeder, I think I come at this just having looked at what we've done with animal breeding in terms of improving efficiency over the years. And I'll take the case of dairy cattle as a classic example. where since the introduction of advanced technologies in dairy cattle production per cow per year, if you look at 1944, there were 25.6 million dairy animals. We have 16 million fewer cows in the US today as a result of improved productivity. However, we're producing 60% more milk. And so you can see here we're now producing 84.2 billion kilograms with a dramatically reduced herd. How are we doing that? Through improvements mostly, or I like to think partly due to genetics, but I'll give the nutritionists a little bit of credit as well, and the environment. Yes, you're welcome. I kind of saw you sitting there, Don, so I could if you hadn't been there, I would have taken all the credit. But you know, this particular technology, artificial insemination, relatively non-controversial nowadays, but it really enables you to make very rapid genetic progress because you can select the very best animals to be the sire of very, very large numbers of offspring. And if we look at this particular bull, he's quite a famous bull in your dairy industry. He has been used and had 80,000 daughters, 2.3 million granddaughters, and 6.5 million great-granddaughters. So I surely hope the animals breeder that selected him had it right. He's had a pretty big impact on the dairy industry. And so this technology has really dramatically improved the production per cow. But initially, it was a very controversial technology. Getting interest. The bull sellers didn't want artificial insemination. It was going to compete with their business. And so what was it that helped the adoption of this particular technology? It was field-tested research that accompanied AI, basically showing that it was safe and it produced healthy calves, it removed the problem of venereal diseases, and it was overcome with facts. The Extension Service played an important role in distributing these facts. And if you think back in the 50s when this was happening, they didn't have Twitter to work on there, which may have worked in their favour. I may say that current productivity of the cattle is very detrimental in terms of their animal welfare or their animal health. I think there's also a side to that discussion that has to be said in that when you have very productive animals or production systems, that has a very big environmental impact in a positive way. And what this graph shows is the comparison between 2007 and 1944, how much reduced we are able to be in terms of numbers of animals, amount of feed used per kilogram of milk, or per kilogram of output. And so basically, if you have a look here, land is down to 10%, manure 24%. There's been a 2/3 reduction in the greenhouse gas per glass of milk since 1950s as a result of these genetic improvements. And so I think that has to come into these discussions about what is the best production system, because really that has very positive environmental benefits. And if we look globally at the average carbon footprint per kilogram of milk, if you want to look at it that way, there's an inverse relationship between the productivity of animals and the carbon footprint per pound of beef or per pound of milk, as you like. And if environmental sustainability was the only consideration that you took into account, the conclusion might be that all regions should adopt the North American, Western European style systems, and or that dairying should just be focused in those areas and discouraged in less productive regions, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. However, that really ignores the significant social, both status and nutritional, and economic value of dairying in less developed regions, and this has to be taken into consideration. The challenge for global dairy production is to improve productivity and optimise sustainability within each region, rather than prescribe a one-size-fits-all production system of management practices. And I think that's very frustrating. I think that such things are really very much environmentally dependent, and there's no one production system that's superior or inferior in any particular location. There's just a number of different factors that will come into play as to whether it's a sustainable production system for that particular location. And I'm certainly not suggesting that high-yielding Holsteins would be well suited to an environment like this. But I am suggesting that there's a lot that can be done with genetics and breeding. We have this delightful diversity in our beef cattle populations, and really there are high-performing animals that could be subject to just conventional selection. And some of the developing nations are not actually doing performance recording to enable them to select the most efficient animals for their particular production system because they've not got records being kept. And so these are very basic management protocols that could be implemented. It doesn't have to be a high-tech protocol in order to try to increase this intrinsic yield gap that is occurring in some countries. And so I really think, as a breeder, of course, that there's a lot of potential use in crosses of local breeds and actually improving the productivity of local breeds using methods we know well work, which is conventional selection and progeny recording. There are, of course, many technological solutions out there, and maybe you thought I'd be speaking my whole talk about genetic engineering, but really I see there's a whole range of technologies which may or may not make sense for certain environments, and many of these technical solutions may not be affordable or feasible for smallholders. And I think that probably a technology that would be really useful there is a very active extension service, and I think that maybe exporting the land grant model of extension would really help to improve productivity and optimize production management systems in developing countries. So that's the background of the production challenge viewpoint. There are others, however, who have a consumption challenge viewpoint. And this viewpoint requires changes to the dietary drivers that determine food production and basically demand restraint. So rather than saying, yes, we'll provide all that animal protein, we need to actually rather restrain our demand. And this conviction tends to be driven by the conviction that excessive consumption, particularly of high-impact foods, such as meat and dairy products, is a leading cause of both environmental and health crises that we face, and that technological improvements alone will not be able to address the problem. This perspective also tends to highlight research findings that reduced consumption of livestock products would actually benefit health. But it tends to ignore the fact that in developing countries, in many parts of the world, there's an ongoing problem of hunger and micronutrient deficiencies that still affect millions of poor people worldwide, especially in rural areas. And I guess as an animal scientist, I do think that there are a lot of benefits of livestock production and consumption that go beyond the consumption of the product itself. And the importance of our global livestock populations to the billion people that rely on them can't be underestimated. And so if we just take a first world perspective of consumption of livestock and ignore the fact that in some developing countries it serves a very useful, not only nutrient source, but also has a number of other values to those production systems. And, we've been associated with domesticated animals since 10,000 BC, about the same time as we've had association with domestic plants. This association, I think, is still critical to the well-being of billions of people throughout the world in many developing countries. And at this stage, I don't think there's a viable alternative to livestock in developing countries for many of the countries of the world. Then finally, there's kind of the socioeconomic challenge viewpoint, which kind of considers both production and consumption and sees the problem of one as imbalance. And many within this perspective tend to advocate a central role for smallholders, particularly women, in farming a diverse range of indigenous crops and livestock breeds for local markets. More localised, diverse systems are seen as better able to deliver the full range of micronutrients needed for good health than the global supply chains, which tend to produce and distribute a simplified range of processed foods and fat-dense commodities. It really looks beyond just the nutritional role that animals play and understands that livestock play a role in the livelihood of these people, and that this, in effect, has an effect on health. However, many in this camp, if you will, tend to romanticize the smallholder production and would like to pursue agroecological approaches and really don't consider whether that's going to actually provide sufficient yield to feed people and lift them out of poverty. And so I think if you look at these different viewpoints, you can see how sometimes we end up just having arguments because if you're focused in one camp and not really thinking about the broader implications globally, you tend to not realise the implications of stressing one particular viewpoint over the other. And there are weaknesses and inconsistencies in all three of these different viewpoints, and often stakeholders are too immersed in their particular framework to recognise very valid concerns that groups in the other challenges are bringing up. And I think that's sometimes why we talk at cross purposes and get frustrated when we can't make any progress because we're kind of arguing different approaches. And so I think that certainly we're going to have to improve the efficiency of food production, but that approach on its own is not going to deliver a sustainable food system, and equal attention needs to be paid to the different framings as I've discussed. And I think that it's becoming increasingly obvious that broad interdisciplinary research is really going to be required, drawing on many different skill sets and groups of both scientists and also the international development community and economists will be required to address this problem. And I really believe that not paying attention to the values of these diverse stakeholders is really the source of a lot of disagreement and miscommunication, and leads to a lot of the food fights that we tend to see out there in the media, certainly. So, really hunger is the enemy, not an alternative production system. And that's, I guess, a point I really want to emphasise. And I think it's intriguing, if you look at the press, the focus on Ebola at the moment, when you look at the actual risk of death, starvation is a really big risk of death, and yet there's very little emphasis placed on that in the media. And in media terms, the challenge is to tell that story in a way that arrests the attention of individuals and governments in a way that demands a response. And I think that's maybe the challenge of the Borlaug dialogues here is how to get that response. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about scientific communication. And there was a really interesting article or issue of PNAS that just came out, The Science of Scientific Communication. And as a scientist, I'm like, all right, let's have a look what the scientific literature says about scientific communication. And so, true to being a scientist, I went and had a look at what that particular journal had to say. And, I think today, scientists and also doctors find themselves outnumbered and outgunned by vast armies of individuals who feel entitled to pass judgment on matters of evidence and admirable aspiration without troubling themselves to obtain a basic understanding of the issues. And I think that's really the frustrating point that I certainly find myself associated with. And there was a very interesting article in this issue of the PNAS. It's actually a model called the Spiral of Silence model, and interestingly it was first proposed by a lady, Elizabeth, in 1974. And basically this model, as is shown here on the little graph here, suggests that many people are fearful of isolating themselves in social settings. And so if there's a particular topic that's maybe taboo to discuss at cocktail parties, like, I don't know, maybe eating beef or using implants in beef, people tend to just not talk about it. And so it creates this impression that there's a lot of agreement on the side that's being discussed, and that the groups that are maybe have an alternative viewpoint tend to just be quiet and not get into a debate over that particular issue. And what's happening now with the internet is we have these mediated realities where we have scientific fact getting created, but where the public is getting their information from is through these mediated realities. And the mediated realities are not always amplifying what the scientific facts are saying. In fact, sometimes they're amplifying the exact opposite of what the scientific facts are saying. And there's very little direct interaction between scientists and the public understanding, as indicated by those very small little arrows, and very large interactions happening between the mediated realities and the public understanding and perception of reality. And so what tends to happen is you get groups, especially in the mediated realities, that kind of reinforce their own biases, and they only read material that reinforces their own biases, and they're somewhat insulated from what the actual facts say because everybody that's on their chat group agrees with them. And so you have this kind of reinforcing situation where information that's patently wrong, for example, is it safe does pasteurization make milk safer? I think Pasteur kind of worked that out a long time ago. It's mind-boggling to me that we have this issue that we know the science is rock solid on, and we have people that are willing to drink unpasteurized milk and expose their children to that potential risk, despite the fact it's very well known that there's very real risk and danger associated with that. As a scientist, it's mind-boggling that that can be the case. But what I think is interesting, and that I kind of was interested to hear that there's, an Occupy the World Food Prize movement that's being planned for the next couple of days. And I understand the intent is to try to get arrested. And it was kind of interesting to me that in this actual paper, and this is a quote, so this isn't my interpretation, this is what the paper actually said, is that the mechanisms outlined in the spiral of silence are the basis of communication strategies for many interest groups. Anti-GMO activists, for example, often rely on activities with high public visibility, such as unregistered demonstrations that lead to arrests, to create media coverage. The hope is that this publicity with these activities will create and lead to inflated public perceptions of how widespread the opposition to the technology such as GMOs is, and potentially trigger a spiral of silence in its wake. In other words, if everybody's against GMOs, and I maybe think they're safe because that's what the data says, maybe I'll be quiet so as not to get socially ostracized. And so, what is the role then of science in countering this? And I think there is some interesting work that can be done using particularly the internet and social media, and this particular paper goes on to say that scientists and universities need to develop proactive communication strategies that accurately portray scientific consensus in public discourse. And I applaud some of the land-grant universities have realised that and are starting to put together active education and outreach campaigns to really start challenging these misconceptions about where there is very broad scientific consensus, but we're not seeing that in the actual, in the press. And I believe that organisations such as CAST that get together the comprehensible, hopefully, task force reports and commentaries and issue papers written at a level of policymakers and the general public and distribute them widely to non-scientists are serving that informational void that tries to get at the fact that there's very little actual fact that often gets discussed in the social media. And interestingly, it's been found that even if you just have one person that's supporting a minority opinion on a chat site or on Twitter or wherever, that really tends to deplete the majority of much of its power, and coming back and saying, well, no, that's not what the fact says, that's not what the data says, actually has a very strong effect at taking away some of the information. And I think there's interestingly today in National Geographic, there is starting to be some thoughtful discussions around topics that were previously, I consider, subject to the spiral of silence. And I actually work in beef cattle production, and I think there's a really interesting article that's come out, Carnivore's Dilemma, and you can see there, unhealthy, nutritious, cruel, delicious, unsustainable, all-American. And this particular article starts to discuss all the intricate trade-offs that are associated with production-enhancing technologies. Is grass-fed better than feedlot cattle? Should we even eat beef? And it's kind of encouraging to see a thoughtful discussion in the media and starting to come out, because it suggests that maybe some of the facts are coming through where previously you've been kind of shut down by this spiral of silence. However, The internet has also been used to reinforce the spiral of silence. And I don't know if all of you are familiar with this particular rat study. It's one of my favourites. It's got a few scientific issues. No controls would be one of them. But you know, the impact of these types of very sensational studies are quite breathtaking. Within hours, the news of this study had been blogged and tweeted more than 1.5 million times. You know how many times my papers get tweeted? You know, genomic selection, yeah, tweet. Never happens, you know. And so, but what happens when you have this type of high impact publication is just real world consequences as a result of a 200 rat study. It's just mind-blowing to me. And actually it was kind of ironic, I guess, we got a little Eat Healthy, Non-GMO Foods brochure. I'm not sure if any of you else got this in your room or under your door. But here, a 2012 study from France, 2-year study on rats fed GMO corn, showed that the rats developed huge tumours the size of ping pong balls. It still goes on. This is a retracted study. This particular strain of rat, for those of you not familiar with this study, is prone to getting these types of cancers as they age, and 2 years is old for a rat, and so it's not unexpected to see these tumours. And what's kind of interesting to me, of course, is there's no actual control on this particular image. So it wasn't in his study, and when Dr. Oz put it up, he was just trying to show how bad GMOs were, so he just conveniently omitted the third rat, which didn't have GMOs in it. That was actually drinking Roundup or something along those lines. And so, you know, it's kind of frightening how pervasive these groups in the internet are, and how they will self-reinforce their own viewpoints and not allow any other information into their little understanding of the science. And it perhaps explains some of the big misconceptions that are out there. And it's perhaps as concerning to a public sector scientist is that when you do try and put out science-based information, you tend to try to get a silence of the science-based dialogue. And I'll just give you an example of, this is my last 5 peer-reviewed publications. First 4, I don't think got twittered, sad to say, even though there was review papers there on applied animal genomics. But some of you may be familiar with a paper that came out on the 1st of October where we did a review of the prevalence and impacts of genetically engineered feedstuffs on livestock populations. Briefly, we did an analysis, a lit review of all the peer-reviewed studies, and then we looked at the production and health trends of our commercial livestock populations. We have a large number of animals we consume every year in the US, about 9 billion chickens and then a few 100,000 dairy cows and a bunch of pigs. And basically, they didn't show any perturbed trends in health and safety. That's bottom line what this paper was. It was a review paper. Well, it got picked up by Forbes, and so specifically John Entine came out with a fairly out there heading. Certainly wouldn't be what a scientist would say about this, but he's communicating that the debate about GMO safety is over thanks to a new trillion-meal study. Well, I tell you what, once that came out, I found out what my Twitter account could get up to. And I don't know that I want my next study getting tweeted because it gets a bit nasty out there. And I kind of put up here this little internet, or little Twitter exchange. So this particular veterinarian says, no, it wasn't. There weren't 1 billion animals in meta-analysis. #liar. Oh, come on. Then we start to have, you know, is there a reason you key in on the poultry instead of dairy information? Was it dairy info? Is it not long-term enough? I respond, I did discuss dairy data in the paper and also multiple long-term peer-reviewed controlled studies. All show no effect. Next one, why don't you include problems with this particular methodology? Advantages, disadvantage, most meta-analysis do. Well, in 140 characters, it's a bit hard to respond to that one, so I'm like, well, read the paper, and you'll see that I do discuss the limitations. And then we have the veterinarian who wasn't too thrilled with me. I didn't discuss antibiotic use in the context of somatic cell count and growth promoting. Typical, #liar in capitals now. And so someone's here, oh, well, you're still giving no logical arguments why you think Dr. Van Eenennaam has no credibility. Can you not articulate? And then my colleague Kevin Falter from Florida says, this is why scientists don't engage. It's just not worth the abuse. And, you know, trying to discuss scientific studies in 140 characters is kind of like scientific Tourette syndrome to me. There's hashtag not enough room to discuss complex topics, you know, and then, of course, you start getting the memes out there, and I guess this is a sign of, I'm not sure if this is a particularly promising sign, but obviously this study had an impact, and now it's on a roll of toilet paper. And I really think, you know, that there is no consensus on the safety of GMOs. We keep hearing that getting harped on, despite everything the scientific evidence says to the contrary. And I do think that, you know, scientists are going to get to know how to use memes better, and I particularly love this meme. I just think it's just clever, because it really makes you what's going on there. I thought Dave should have a little quote in this presentation. But, you know, when you've got these kind of falsehoods out there, there's kind of a pattern you see. First, cast doubt on the science. Then question the personal motives and integrity of the scientists that are defending it. Then magnify genuine disagreements among scientists, and they do exist, with non-experts who just have minority opinions as authorities, exaggerate the potential harm caused by the issue at hand, frame the issues as a threat to personal freedom or choice, and then claim that acceptance would repudiate a key philosophy, religious belief, or practice of a group. Has anyone seen this trend happening in some of these controversial topics? It's pretty predictable, actually. And then just finally, I'll finish with this slide, and that is in this particular paper that came out also in the PNAS issue. They show that scientists are quite considered to be competent, but they're considered to be quite cold. And as communicators, you don't want to be down in this area of cold, competent people, because they're people that tend to be envied and not particularly liked. And people report that particular group down here, and sorry, Tom, wherever you are, the lawyers are way you know what they reported? That they feel slightly good and not so bad when mundane bad events like getting splashed by a taxi happens to people in this group. And so I guess my message to scientists is you better be empathetic and move yourself up here, or people are going to be quite happy when you get splashed by a taxi. And so the message is that people want to know you care and why you care, and that you have to try and be human and not speak in a scientific voice. And so at the risk of getting socially ostracized for not holding the majority opinion and getting people happy that I get splashed by a taxi, I do try to communicate about what issues that otherwise are somewhat subject to this spiral of silence, because the popular narrative doesn't agree with what the scientific fact says. And I speak about all of these controversial issues: cloned beef, the FDA hearing on the genetically engineered salmon, ethics of animal biotechnology, should we genetically engineer animals? The Dr. Oz show, GMOs, are they dangerous for your health? And then most recently the cast issue paper number 54, Robin Borlaug was number 1, this was 54, the potential impact of mandatory labelling of genetically engineered food in the United States. All very controversial topics that have to have science brought to them so that we can have an informed and rational discussion in the future. So with that background, I work to interject scientific information, and I really do believe that effectively communicating science is one of the most important things that scientists contribute to future generations. And shown here with my family and my husband Joel, who's sitting up the front here, and you will see that we've just finished our meal. I'm sure we drank pasteurised milk. My kids are fully vaccinated. I think we probably ate conventional food, but I am actually contributing something else to future generations, and that is new young scientists. And so this is my son's 8th grade craft project, and you will notice that this little candy bowl is actually undergoing mitosis. So we are officially a family of total science nerds, and that's proud to be so. So with that, I would like to introduce you to a new YouTube video that has just been posted, and I'm going to play right now. And it's basically one that I asked my kids what thought music was popular this year, and they told me there's a song called What Does the Fox Say? If you guys haven't seen it, then I would encourage you to do so. And so to thank you very much for bestowing on me the honour of receiving the 2014 Cast Borlaug Communication Award. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and play this 5-minute video.